I extend a warm welcome to this virtual session hosted by University of Northwestern's Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs and Pritzker School of Law in collaboration with Addis Ababa University, College of Law and Governance, and Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program. Today we have gathered to delve into thought-provoking book titled Between Failure and Redemption, the Future of the Ethiopian Social Contract, which emerged from a convening of more than 30 prominent Ethiopian scholars in Addis Ababa in June 2022. Our objective for this book launch are twofold. First, we aim to facilitate an in-depth discussion, conversation, and understanding on the book's key themes, such as governance, democratization, human rights, federalism, decentralization, and the role of civil society. Through exploring these complexities, we hope to shed light on Ethiopia's social contract and its implication for the country's future. Second, we aim to foster a vibrant and inclusive discussion among all participants, and I encourage each of you to actively engage by sharing your thoughts, questions, reflections in the virtual menu. We value your contribution, and we believe that through a collective exchange of ideas, we can enrich our understanding and contribute to the ongoing debate and conversation surrounding Ethiopia's social contract and the future of constitutionalism in Ethiopia. As we embark on this virtual book launch, let's embrace the opportunity to learn, exchange, and explore new ideas, perspectives together. Our aim is to create a space where diverse voices are heard, critical thinking can flourish, and where we can collectively envision a more just, inclusive future for Ethiopia. Today, we have the privilege of having three distinguished speakers who will share their insight on the book and engage in discussion about promoting peace and dialogue in Ethiopia. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed speakers. Our esteemed speakers are, I'll make a brief introduction about our esteemed speakers. First, I'll start, our first speaker will be Dr. Getachew Asafa. Dr. Getachew Asafa has extensive research in academia, research and consultancy. He's the author of numerous articles that have appeared in various national and international journals, including the American Journal of Comparative Law and International Journal on Minority Groups' Rights. And he has also authored and edited many books, including Legal Pluralism, Ethiopia, Actors and Challenges and Solutions, which was published in 2020. And another book on grassroots justice in Ethiopia, The Contribution of Customary Disputes Resolution, which was published in 2008 with Alula Pankhurst. So from July 2018 through December 2021, he served as in the reform initiative of the Ethiopian government as the chairperson for the working group on legal and institutional reform of democratic institutions, composed of the National Election Board, Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, Institute of the Ombudsman, and House of Federation. Our second speaker is Dr. Solomon Nuguse. He is the Associate Professor of Law and Federal Studies and former Dean of the College of Law and Governance at Addis Ababa University. He has extensive research experience focused on decentralization, comparative constitutional federalism, law development, and human rights. He served as a senior resource person in decentralization and governance, and he's a widely published scholar in the area of constitutional law, physical federalism, and human rights. He has also participated in many national and international platforms. And in addition to his research, teaching, and mentorship role for master's and PhD students at Addis Ababa University, he has been providing extensive service to various governmental and non-government organizations. He is currently serving as a senior legal advisor for Ethiopian Civil Society Organizations Council. He also serves as an esteemed board chair of one of a local civil society organization working to promote peace, dialogue, and conflict transformation in Ethiopia. Our third speaker is Maskaram Gasset. She is a commissioner for women's and children's rights at the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Maskaram is a prominent human rights lawyer, a keen advocate for women and girls' rights. She's currently a member of the United Nations Working Group on discrimination against women and children, and co-chair of the Independent Expert Mechanism on Discrimination and Violence Against Women. She previously served a position as a High Court judge, and she was also a deputy director for the Institute for Human Rights and Development in Africa. Maskaram has also worked closely with African Union, the United Nations human rights bodies, and closely worked with various regional and international UN and AU mechanisms, and she was involved in drafting various AU and UN human rights laws, policies, and studies. She served as an expert member in various working groups of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and engaged as associate scholar at several universities worldwide. Maskaram spearheaded prominent human rights institutions and initiatives, and earned recognition for her work as a human rights defender. Welcome our guest speakers. These speakers bring a wealth of knowledge and experience in academia, research, and advocacy, making them, ideal contributors to today's discussion. And I hope the session will provide valuable insights and contribute to the ongoing efforts of promoting peace and dialogue in Ethiopia. Before I welcome our guest speakers, I just want to mention a few points about presentation format. Each speakers will have 5 to 7 minutes to provide their general comments, observations, and critiques on the book. Following their presentation, I'll engage them in a brief probing question, and each speakers will have 2 minutes to reflect on the questions asked. Overall, for the Q&A session, after presentation and the moderated discussion, I'll open the floor to participants for question and answer. And I encourage everyone to make their contribution, to ask their questions concisely, to make the best use of our time, and to give others opportunity to participate. So during the speaker's presentation, I encourage participants to utilize the virtual chat menu on the left side to write down their question. This will allow us to streamline the Q&A session. And please ensure your questions are brief and concise to maximize our time and provide opportunity for others to participate. Again, I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I hope the session will foster a meaningful dialogue on the future of the Ethiopian social contract. Without further ado, let's begin with our first speaker, Dr. Getachew. Dr. Getachew, the virtual floor is open for you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saifa. So I would like to say thank you to Northwestern University and Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs for publishing this book and for the dissemination. I would try to raise some outstanding things that I found very interesting and informative in the book. So that will open the discussion. So the book, which is edited by Dr. Abadir Ibrahim and Mr. Kokobe Walde, opens with a well-written introduction by Dr. Abadir. Also, interesting preface by Professor Thomas Garrity of Northwestern University. And I must say also a very moving opening remark by Professor Sosna Getachew Haile of Northwestern University. The essays in the book and the discussions made by the participating scholars after each presentation of the essays during the convening, which are also made part of the book, have truly made the future of Ethiopia's social contract or its constitutional future their central concern. I am confident to say that the book could be considered as the first of its kind in almost comprehensively discussing the most important constitutional and also related issues, both as a matter of rules and as fact of practical challenges. One of its unique contributions, in my view, is, for example, it is bringing into the debate of the importance of deep-rooted social values and norms as possible solutions to the political problems the country is facing. In this regard, Dr. Semena Iyalew's Reherahe, which he translated as radical compassion, and Dr. Zalalam's empathy are very good cases in point. Overall, the 14 essays categorized under 5 parts, and the discussions that were made on each essay were wonderfully edited and included in the book. The rich contents of the essays, in most cases, complement each other. And of course, there were different viewpoints promoted by the scholars, which would contribute to the broadening of the debate. As I alluded to earlier, Dr. Semena and Dr. Zalalam, for example, have sought to expand the search for solutions to Ethiopia's multifaceted challenges into the social field. Semena, for example, explored the relevance of Reherahe, radical compassion, in this regard. He argued that there are rich horizontal social relations of the various groups of the country that need to be formalized and included into formal politics. I think this is a very good start. I believe this will spur further research into the social values of our diverse communities to develop and enrich Semena's very valuable start. Zalalam's empathy is also a valuable contribution. His emphasis that attempts be made for facts and truths to be approached in an empathetic manner points, I believe, in the right direction. Also, Dr. Shimallis Mulugeta Kennes call for exploring indigenous norms and their institutionalization for designing solutions to Ethiopia's problems can be added to these new calls that are made by the scholars. Other essays looked at issues of citizenship and citizenship rights from the point of view of the current constitutional system and pointed out the weaknesses of the current constitutional arrangement with a view to pointing out areas of possible reform. Dr. Tigist and Ms. Taguada's paper on the constitutional rights of women in this regard brought out an interesting perspective, not much discussed so far in my view, and that is the impact of the emphasis on the rights of ethno-national communities in the country on the promotion of women's rights, the effect of emphasis on ethno-national communities' rights is eclipsing the promotion of the rights of women. I think this is an important start to further elaborate on these discussions. Professor Addis's very incisive critique of Ethiopia's ethnic federal constitutional order is another valuable contribution. Professor Adino discussed many important problems and issues, one of which is, for example, the fact that the Constitution does not bestow equal and full citizenship rights on all Ethiopians. And he discussed the dangers this and associated problems in the Constitution could bring to the constitutional existence of the country. Similarly, Dr. Barrihun Adunya's insightful criticism of the constitutional structure from multiple perspectives is noteworthy. For example, he also indicated the problems that the constitutional arrangement has on rights of citizens because of its emphasis on ethnic rights and its institutionalization of what he calls ethnocracy. Other essays by Professor Jonathan and Professor Asafa have also brought out the problems associated with the praxis of the federal structure. They have discussed several examples that show the lack of federal credentials of Ethiopia's federal arrangement. They called for solutions, some of which would call for constitutional reform in this regard. Dr. Abadir and Dr. Jueria's jointly authored paper has brought to the debate issues of minority and indigenous rights from the perspective of one of the major ethno-linguistic communities of Ethiopia, the Somali. One would wonder how minority rights issue could be associated with the third most populous group in the country, which has its own regional state in the federation. But they have offered in the paper an engaging discussion and facts that would lend credence to their analysis. Dr. Adam and Dr. Samir have also made interesting and reform-oriented contributions. Dr. Adam, for example, emphasized the need for genuine deliberation among Ethiopians before constitutional reform could be embarked upon. He urges the deployment of national dialogue for these purposes. He also proposes a liberal constitutional system where political parties rather than ethnic identity would be made the major players. Likewise, Dr. Samir calls for an inclusive participatory political settlement, which will address both constitutional design issues and state-society relations. He says that national dialogue could offer a real opportunity for doing both of these important tasks. Dr. Zamalak's and Dr. Muhammad's papers make suggestions, among others, on the need to de-emphasize ethnicity by, among others, revisiting the alignment of state boundaries with ethnic identity, which may include the need for breaking up of major states into smaller parts. So overall, the essays and papers that are covered in the book have discussed many of the vexing issues facing Ethiopia at the moment, and the hard choices that should be made in order to improve on the existing problems, the need for public deliberation among the members of the society on these important issues, and the need to engage on constitutional reform on some of these important problems, and in fact also bringing into practice some of the provisions of the constitutions that have not been properly practiced. So I want to end with this, Dr. Saifa, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Getachew. Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Dr. Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Saifa, for the introduction, and thank you, Professor Tom and his team for organizing, and the members of the organizing committee for inviting me to speak in this important book launch event. I will try to make my presentation in a way that will build on the presentation made by Getachew, so that it will also lead us to further discussions. Here I would like to make clear that I don't make any endorsement or a specific assertion to the contributions made by the authors, but I will try to say a few words on the main themes and relevant contributions of the book and some issues to be considered for future similar endeavors. For me, when I participate and when I read the book and now at the launching event, I consider it to talk about the timing of the conference itself, and the timing of the launching of the book has their own implication. The timing, May 2022, when we were hoping that the conflict, the war which ravaged the northern part of the country, which almost covered 800 kilometers diameter from Addis, and we have witnessed the consequence of that war ravaging the community and the area widely covered in the northern part of the country. And also we have witnessed conflicts here and there which affected various communities in the south and in the eastern part of the country as well. So as the editors clearly captured that moment, I quote, the country was in a state of war, a political unsettlement, a revolutionary situation, a transitional moment, a state nearing failure, that this kind of discussion has become really relevant. If we take the tension with the political actors, the persistent ethnic divisions, the tension between the centralizing tendencies and the state fragility, and on top of this, the war that I mentioned earlier, they all necessitate the importance of building social contract, and then discussing on this issue is, I consider that timely and relevant in the Ethiopian context. And now when we are talking about the book launch and this event today, we have to take note that we are at the time when national dialogue and transitional justice are on the discussion forum. Therefore, if we have to build consensus on these processes, if they are going to be effective, I would say that the contents of the book and the opinions expressed there will contribute to make the upcoming discussion successful. Of course, we are going to see how it will manifest themselves in making the promises of dialogue and transitional justice effective in this country. The relevance of the book can be seen, as Getachew earlier said, not only from the contents that we see from these books, but also on similar issues that they have addressed in their earlier publications and discussions on making the Ethiopian federal constitutional promises effective and help resolve some of the perennial questions that we have in this country. So when we are talking about the relevance of the book and also the discussion aiming at redeeming the Ethiopian Federation, we cannot ignore the constitutional design as well as the federal practice that we have seen for the last 3 decades. So, as we repeatedly said, Ethiopia depicted as a good case study of having a federal constitution without a federal practice, and sometimes a constitution without constitutionalism. Therefore, having this kind of book will elucidate our discussions one step further and help readers to engage themselves on some of the outputs of the book. And the discussion in this book have considered the extremely polarized politics in the country and the critical issues related to the constitutional design. I'm not going to repeat what Getachew already said. And also, they considered in their writings the tensions in relation to the ethnic dimensions of the constitution and the political processes, how the practice lacks federal features, and how the system developed on one hand centralization and on the other fragmentation and institutional fragility in the country. And they also considered the gap between the constitutional promises and the reality on the ground, which lacks inclusivity and good governance. And at the same time, they have tried to show the need for institutional and political reform to get out of this political quagmire that we have been experiencing for long. But I would also say that although a lot of issues have been covered in this book, there are important issues that we have to see in future endeavors to be addressed. At least the contending issues concerning federal capital and the economy. And I hope if we have to organize similar programs, these issues will be taken into consideration. In relation to the constitutional design, in addition to the promise to build federal democratic republic, these books considered whether these problematic features of unitary and confederal one have really affected the federal practice, or they are really intended to be included in the constitution. You can see the discussions made by Asafa and the discussion made by Brahanu, which concerns this issue, which created ambiguity in the practice as well. And the other important issue in the design is in relation to the citizens' rights, which are overemphasized by the ethno-linguistic groups' interest, and which, as the authors repeatedly mentioned, that we have difficulties in ensuring the protection of equal rights for all citizens if we have to implement this constitution as it is. And in relation to that, one of the important contribution and novel approach is especially towards building a social contract. We have seen a strong appeal made by Semena, Zelalem, and Shimelis on radical compassion, empathy, and indigenous knowledge as a common social values to impact the political process and build social contract. Well, when I see these appeals, they are innovative, they are important, but it reminds me of the issues, the discussions that we had at AAU some years back, when one of the university members asked the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi that it's only empathy and compassion that can save the country from going deep into a free fall of ethnic conflicts. So my worry is similarly that would these issues convince the political actors and lead to redeeming the Ethiopian federal practice from free fall, or would simply remain as a social appeal to the readers in our context. The other important contribution that we can see is the constitutional power sharing arrangement in addition to the constitutional designs, as it has been presented by Safa, by Adam Kase, and others. Would that really be saving the problem that we are witnessing in the country, or would that be implemented without touching, without reforming the constitution as it is being practiced? Is something that we can discuss upon it, but some have also raised their concerns whether this kind of approach would help in the Ethiopian context. Institutional reforms, ensuring participation and representation of constituent units at the federal level, especially on the policy making, and challenging the centralizing and fragmentation realities, that the contradictory realities that we are witnessing in the country, has also been raised. And Asafa recommended a kind of integrationist presidential system, or this consensual power sharing arrangement, which sometimes appear to be a confederal one, is something subject to discussion. There are also several institutional reforms to make this building social contract in Ethiopia, saving the federal promises in the constitution from failure. But it is also important to note here, as the book clearly indicated at every chapter, that it doesn't mean that on our discussion that there was consensus on every issues presented in the conference, which I would say is one of the important input of this book, which indicated divergent views, which indicated some different approaches for solving the problem. And I think that would help in the future to engage in a more meaningful and in a more depths to build a constitutional reform in a meaningful way in Ethiopia. Therefore, my worry is finally to make an appeal to the discussion. The dilemma and uncertainty on making the necessary corrections to the federal practice towards building a social contract is clearly envisaged, because sometimes in the books that we have seen, in the discussions as well, which I participated, we also tend to reform by using the constitution as it is, and sometimes we also tend to make a fundamental constitutional reform because we have witnessed this war and also institutional fragility and lack of good governance in this country. Therefore, there is a strong appeal to make an urgent constitutional reform. Therefore, would that be possible by simply keeping the constitution as it is something that we can debate about, because some of the recommendations that we have seen in the book appear to be using the constitution as a savior of the political problem that we have seen in our country, at least for the last 3 to 4 years. Having said so, I will reflect on some of the remaining issues because my time has already lapsed.
Yeah.
And
but I will have more opportunity during the
yes, more opportunity. And thank you very much. Back to you, Saifa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salamon. Now I'm inviting Commissioner Maskaram to make her brief intervention. Maskaram, the virtual floor is for you.
Thank you so much, Saifa. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. I would like to thank very much the organizers for the opportunity to be part of this discussion and to be able to share a few reflections on the book. I would like to congratulate the team for facilitating important and timely discourse, not only through the publication, but also through a successful convening that brought together several scholars. My appreciation, of course, goes to all the authors and reviewers and discussants for their valuable contributions to the discussion. It was a very interesting journey for me going through the book. The book actually is very interesting as it captures the perspectives of various Ethiopian scholars, not just in the form of papers and essays, but also conference discussions that represent vibrant academic dialogue, which one must, I shouldn't have missed. The diversity of the scholars from various fields, such as constitutional law, federalism, political science, history, was very impressive. And it actually is a proof that it adds to the richness of the dialogue and the contributions. The timeliness of the dialogue, the convening that happened in the previous year, and also the coming out of the publication cannot be overemphasized, as already highlighted by previous colleagues earlier. The attempt by authors and discussants to address the social and political challenges, as well as the constitutional structures, is commendable. Beyond the substantive contribution, it was very interesting for me to note that the effort itself in creating the space for a vibrant academic dialogue and the symbolic significance of that cannot be underestimated. The book generally contains very relevant and interesting systematically organized sections and chapters. I would like to focus on part 2, which deals with adopting intersectionality in constitutional design. This part contains 2 papers focusing on 2 distinct groups, one on women and the other on minority and indigenous people. What is interesting is that this chapter is about both majority and minority groups. Women, the majority of the Ethiopian society on one hand, and Somalis and other ethnic minorities on the other. Positioning intersectionality both from gender and ethnic dimensions
in the contemporary discussions on the Ethiopian constitutional design can be one of the unique contributions of the book, in my view. Anchoring intersectionality as analytical framework is the central part of this section, and this is very interesting for me. That's why I wanted to focus on this one within the limited time I have. Why does intersectionality matter? Because it offers a lens to analyze and describe the interactions between systems of oppression. It offers the tool to analyze how systems of power can affect the structures of societies and the people within them. As many scholars argued, intersectionality is a call to look at identity in a more nuanced way. First, the chapter on women's rights and Ethiopia's future social contrast, the need to adopt an intersectional approach by Dr. Tigist Shawarega and Tagwada Lebacho brings relevant reflections in exploring the interplay between intersectionality and constitutionalism from a gender or women's rights lens. Interestingly, they have challenged the constitutional design based on the premise what they called a phased liberation approach. The coining of the term and the concept it represents is very interesting and unique. They argue the deprioritization of women as citizens in a political construct where ethnic identity has taken primacy over other issues and inequalities. This actually echoes claims that have been already made by human rights bodies, including the women's rights mechanisms. Not necessarily as part of a constitutional deliberation. It also has been echoed by women's rights activists in Ethiopia, but again, not so much linked to the constitutional design. So in my view, this is what makes the contribution original, placing the debate in a constitutional deliberation. The paper is about citizenship. It brings into perspective women's citizenship in a patriarchal construct of national as well as constitutional structure. And this is not merely about participation, as they argued, which is, of course, essential. Participation is essential, but they brought the positioning of women in the entire system as a political and social entity, which requires looking beyond the normative framework and deals with the broader constitutional politics, practice, and experience. Again, what makes the methodology, choosing the intersectionality as a methodology, very important. In this sense, we note that the paper proposed an expansive and inclusive understanding of the multi-layered social and political realities that deeply affect citizenship rights. This is an important demand in a time women are not visible enough, if not pushed to invisibility, both as a demographic and interest groups at grassroots, as well as policy level deliberations that shape the future of the nation. As we see in most platforms, women are not visible enough in most deliberations. So the question pushing the agenda forward is, how do we institutionalize intersectionality as a political concept, as a constitutional concept? And on this note, I wonder if it might have been worth pushing the boundary a bit further by adding some comparative or good practices from other constitutions and give a glimpse of what the envisioned design might look like for women. Of course, I understand the intention of the paper is to provoke thought for further discussions rather than offering a comprehensive analysis, which was not actually promised by the authors. The paper is indeed valuable in challenging conservative approach that are not open to the value of intersectionality in a constitutional dispensation, which could also be a manifestation of deep-rooted patriarchal conception of constitutionalism. Culture and, in a way, ethnicity can be claimed to be patriarchal, as customary and cultural institutions preserve discriminatory patriarchal beliefs and norms. Based on my work in human rights bodies,
I would argue that most of the things that affect us are deeply intertwined with sex or gender, or with being a man or a woman, in as much as they are about ethnic or linguistic or racial identities. The personal is always political, and also the political is always personal, and Ethiopia is not an exception to this. Hence, centering a gender and intersectional approach in reimagining the constitutional design and political system would be one pragmatic approach. Of course, by no means this should dismiss the legitimate and important question about ethnic-based inequalities that should also be addressed properly. And it does not have to be mutually exclusive. And in my reading, this is not necessarily what the paper proposes. Maybe the paper could be firmer or clearer on whether intersectionality would address a normative gap or implementation gap, or both, in the particular case of Ethiopian constitutional framework. Maybe this is for further investigation and discussion. The other point I would like also to throw in is women not being a homogeneous group. How would we avoid the risk of generalization for women, and how intersectionality could address the various identities of women, be it ethnic and linguistic and other. Given that intersectionality is about multiple and overlapping identities, how do we address, for example, discrimination based on a class of rural women, minority women, indigenous women, etc., as opposed to separate grounds based on just ethnicity or sex or other. Moving quickly to the other paper in the chapter, the paper A Dream Within a Dream, Minorities and Indigenous People and Ethiopia's Constitutional Moments by Dr. Ababa and by Dr. Joeria, also brings intersectional approach as a framework for reimagining the constitutional design. Most importantly, the contribution of the paper is promised to be methodological, and it attempted to capture the lived realities of people, minorities, and indigenous groups, which are not necessarily fully captured through legal methodology, and this makes it very interesting and original. We know that minorities exist in every country, as indigenous people also exist in many. While they enrich the diversity of their societies, they unfortunately face multiple forms of discrimination, resulting in the marginalization and exclusion from political negotiations, among others. And this is the case for Ethiopia as well. An intersectional approach could be one, again, pragmatic approach, as it offers the power relations beyond, analysis of the power relations beyond merely looking at people or community, which is very relevant for the case of Ethiopia, for looking beyond the sheer arrangement provided in the Constitution for nations, nationalities, and peoples. We must acknowledge that there are still debates towards conceptual clarity as to who is a minority, who is indigenous in the Ethiopian context. And very importantly, the paper points to important gaps that needs proper deliberation. The legal gap is one, that the gap exists in defining minorities and indigenous people under the Ethiopian constitution or the broader legal framework. And of course, from a human rights point of view, the paper pointed out that minorities enjoy somewhat better protection in the legal framework, while indigenous do not. The other is also the narrative gap. I'm sorry if I'm rushing, I'm mindful of time. The other is the narrative gap, which manifests in the expression or position, we are all indigenous, especially when it comes to indigenous people. Constructing this conception around indigeneity and also addressing the lack of clarity or lack of recognition of indigeneity as a legal concept is part of the big challenge we are called upon to tackle by the authors. Definitely the call by authors for addressing both the legal and normative gaps is very important and timely. Without doing so, the paper rightly articulates that concerns that majority voices may not be adequately accommodated in future political negotiations in Ethiopia, because structural disadvantages will further be reinforced by design. Leveraging the intersectionality of minority and indigeneity is discussed as a practical solution in the paper. And in my view, it may not be so easy to understand how, in concrete terms, the potential of intersectional approach could be untapped to address the gaps, the legal as well as the narrative gaps, and also how it can also be borrowed to address issues of minorities other than ethnic and indigenous groups, such as religious minorities, or even the various classes of ethnic minorities, which were also raised during the conference discussion. Of course, the authors have not promised to deal with various minority groups or indigenous groups. They were very specific, but I believe these are also worth considering in further discussions. As I wind up, I would like, of course, to appreciate that both chapters offer analytical framework based on intersectionality, and this could be further explored in future discussions. This is very important to relevant topics and concerns raised in other chapters, not only in relation to these two papers. Other chapters such as managing diversity and ensuring inclusive democratic governance might also enjoy consideration from an intersectional perspective. Going forward, it would be helpful if the topic could be further explored from comparative perspectives and human rights perspectives, bringing together other constitutional experiences and also concrete proposals as to what reform or amendments needed to be fleshed out a bit further in future discussions. Earlier, it was pointed out that there is no perfect time other than this to dwell on this topic because of the importance of the time that we are in as we are embarking on a national dialogue, transitional justice, and other peace building and then consensus building processes. On a different note, as a standalone important chapter under the theme of intersectionality, I would have humbly proposed the topic of youth groups and intersectionality. In my view, this is worth exploring, given that the youth is a majority and cross-cutting group, also a politically and socially diverse one. But the citizenship of youth is among the invisible topics in the Constitution and constitutional dialogues, from what I understand. So this would have been worth exploring, and I'm sure it can be part of our future deliberations. In conclusion, the papers and also the entire book successfully invoked and attempted to address critical questions. It catalyzed discussions, and yet fairly leaves us with several unanswered questions, giving us the responsibility to take the debate further. Now, once again, immense appreciations to authors, reviewers, and all involved for offering us such thought-provoking pieces and platform. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maskaram. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions, but I think we took extra time. And I think I prefer to immediately go to the Q&A session because it seems like we might be running out of time. And I'm seeing in the chat, in the Q&A chat menu, a lot of questions for our participants. So I'll bring some of these questions to be addressed by our distinguished speakers. There's a question for, I think, all of the panelists. You're free to make your intervention. I think one of the questions asked from our participants is, what role do you think the Ethiopian diaspora community can play to make constructive contribution towards the constitutional structure reform efforts to unify the country. And that's, I think, one question. I'll read out 2-3 questions and feel free to pick and reply one or two of them. How can Ethiopians urge constitutional amendment when the constitution is inherently rigid to change? Is major reform of the current constitution needed, in the speaker's opinion? If so, what practical role could the elite play in shaping new social contracts and removing controversial articles and provisions in current constitution? Let's just take 2 minutes if speakers want to reflect on these questions, and I can raise more questions. Chat box.
Sure, if I may go.
Dr. Getachew, please. Okay. You have 2 minutes.
Sure. Well, I think these are important questions, relevant questions, and they have come up during the discussion repeatedly during the convening of the scholars as well. So the diaspora, for example, can play a very important role, a constructive role, both as a public, an informed public about the problems that exist in Ethiopia. So leadership in terms of ideas and in terms of making constructive engagement with the issues, I think that would be important. And we know that most considerable problems come from different directions, diaspora included, in terms of either positively or negatively influencing the issues and debates in the country. So I think the diaspora can play a huge role in terms of being a considerable public, as well as in terms of generating ideas for helping steering the debates and the deliberations in the right direction. So I think quite huge contribution in my view. The constitution can be changed and should be changed. That's the debate, and the whole idea of bringing all of these problems and discussions on the table. So constitution, if enough discussion and deliberation and consensus is built, although the amendment provisions are very rigid, I think those amendment provisions can also be used to include and bring about change. So as the scholars were suggesting, any change of the constitution or reform must be preceded by enough deliberation, enough discussion on what needs to be changed, and on essentially peacefully and legally changing what needs to be changed. So if that is done, so although the provisions, the provisions and procedures are stringent, I think they don't stop genuine need for change. So the last question, major reform seems to be needed in some areas of the constitution, on those controversial areas that were flagged by various contributions during the discussion. Revisitation of the federal-state relationship, the revisitation of provisions having to do with ethnic arrangements and the rights and the balanced relationship between the center and the regions, in terms of including serious provisions for protection of rights at the regional level, and creation of new way of looking at the citizenship rights throughout the country. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Getachew. I think you have you've answered make the questions. Maskaram, Dr. Solomon, do you want to
add a few points? Saifa, can I add a few points?
Yes, please.
Just to add on what Getachew said on the role of the Ethiopian diaspora, well, they have a stake and they have played a role in the political process in Ethiopia for the last 3 decades. And they have the expertise. In any case, they have to participate. And recently, in one of the discussion on the importance of national dialogue and the participation, and in the transitional justice, if they are going to be implemented, the diaspora cannot be left alone. They have to participate in any possible manner. But I personally have one point to make. You have to be responsible. Sometimes, you know, whatever feelings you have, liberty you have to express your opinions, it affects people at the local politics and who are victims of the local politics. So you have to be careful on your statements. You have to consider the reality in Ethiopia. And recently we have witnessed on how, you know, there was a meeting in Washington and the jargon, the words that they have used really annoyed many groups here in Addis. Why would they use this offending words and so on? So sometimes we have to be honest, you have to be responsible in the manner that you are participating in the local politics. And with regard to the constitutional amendment, I agree the concern that repeatedly mentioned here. And I have also tried to indicate, I was not, in the book itself and in our discussion, there were attempts that the problems that we have witnessed can be somehow addressed through the constitutional means. But the constitutional means, one, the constitution is frigid. It's not easy to use the constitution for amending it unless we go back to its intent and objective and make some way of really challenging the very nature of the constitution and bring in some informal way of amending the constitution, maybe through political negotiations or through these referendums, whatever the mechanism we have, using the constitutional provision is very challenging. On the other hand, reforming is important because the reality that we are facing in this country forced us to sit down and negotiate. You cannot leave the constitution as it is and promise to make all the necessary change. So I agree the concerns and it's important. The other point which the question refers to empathy and compassion, and why I make a reference to the university professor who asked the late prime minister is that these are not political, political statements. These are not statements made by political groups. Then when you have a political party, you have to make political statements. Asking for empathy and compassion alone cannot solve the problems that we are facing. Therefore, this is to show that the fate of this country is in the hands of the leadership. So sometimes they have to sit down and consider the values that we share, from which group, which ethnic or nationality group we are coming. So it's important to consider and make genuine commitments to make people live together. So in that case, it's important to look into our indigenous values and to look into the problems we have been through for the last 3 decades and aim at how this country will address the chronic social, political, and economic problems. For example, look the economic reality that we are facing. You cannot ignore that. So these require some appeal, to the political actors to come into question. The federal structure, one of the questions is about territories. You can read the book, and one of the authors mentioned that there is some kind of, move to make the necessary territorial adjustment, because territory was one of the causes of this conflict, the war in the northern part of the country. So you cannot ignore that. But how do you do that? Requires, if you use the constitution, it's very challenging. And if you ignore it, and it will be problematic to the people living together in the border areas. That's one point. The other is, we have two groups, at least two groups, who argue that whether it is important to change the constitution or whether it is not, there is no need to touch the constitution, but only look into the practice. If you see the political parties, those parties, ethnic affiliated political parties, they stick to maintaining the constitution as it is. Not all, but some of the outspoken parties. And on the other hand, we have political parties who are, nationalist and who are pro citizenship agenda in the Ethiopian politics. They are in favor of making the necessary changes to the constitution. In between, we have the political actors, those actors who determine the fate of this country. So they have to balance these two challenges, these two groups of opinions, and make the necessary move to make constitutional reforms. And I don't think it is impossible, but it requires a political will to do so. Back to you, sir.
Thank you. I have one question for Maskaram, which is also asked on our chat menu. The question is, can you please clarify the definition or distinction between indigenous minority and ethnic groups? Are these terms used interchangeably? Was one of the question asked for Maskaram.
Thank you, Saifa. I mean, I will just say that the indigeneity and minority, they are distinct, but of course, sometimes they can overlap, but they are not used interchangeably. The human rights framework, the international human rights law framework is actually very clear about who minority groups are and who indigenous people are. Minority, in as much as it might seem about number, it's also about a common culturally shared identity. But indigeneity, indigenous people can be minority groups or not, but beyond the demographic the numeric identity or the demographic nature, it's about also the historical context of, their settlements, their again shared cultural identity. In the paper also, actually, the authors tried to show the distinction between these two identities and how they also overlap. But definitely they are not used interchangeably, and they are not about the same thing, though we can find them overlapping in one community. Thank you.
Thank you, Maskaram. Thank you very much. Well, the other question I'm seeing here is a very important question. Who's the author's target audience? Majority of Ethiopians are not proficient in English language. Do you have a plan to publish in Ethiopian local language to reach the people? I think this is a very important question. We'll take note of this, and as part of the organizing committee, I think, maybe in the next phase of the project, we will definitely think about this, and we've been thinking about it. And it's very important. Language accessibility is very important because it's important to reach out to audience in Ethiopia and to make sure that this thing is translated into local language for wider readership. The other question that I'm seeing here, it's to Dr. Salomon. Why is the view that the Ethiopian constitution is impossible or rigid to reform or amend widely believed, especially among the actors of the Ethiopian political right? Is it about the impossibility of the provision so long as they are applied transparent and democratically, or the fear that the amendment or reform attempts may be rejected by the majority? This is a question from one of our participants.
Okay, thank you, Saifa. Thank you, the participant. Let me make first on Adana and Elizabeth Summers on the two questions. Adana raised on the use, and Elizabeth about religious communities and so on. And these two questions, this is an appeal to the civil society, I would say. So, for example, Adana question on how the use can really, the use is a victim of the ethnicity and ethnic-based politics. And Elizabeth also raised how we can use this book and so. But for both, I would appeal to the civil societies to work hard on, making at least dialogue one of the venues for addressing social problems. And for Elizabeth as well, if she's working on co-workers, in church-related activity, this is to make sensitive about the fractures that we have witnessed in the Ethiopian society, and how to mend that fracture and make a sensible contribution towards building common values in this country, a social contract. So it's good to understand that, and therefore see how church-affiliated institutions can contribute on that. With regard to the question that you raised, the impossibility, it's not my opinion, but read Article 104 and 5 of the Constitution. The contending constitutional provisions require unanimity for amendment. And how on earth do you amend this constitution? Unless, you have a dominant party and a dominant party with effective control of the regional government, regional councils, it's very difficult to do that. And the challenge that we have witnessed recently is reflected in this book. On the one hand, it appears to be a move toward centralizing. On the other hand, because it cannot effectively control the fragmentation that we have seen in the Ethiopian politics and even in the state-federal relations. So by having this reality, how can you bring in consensus under Article 105 of the Constitution and make an amendment to Article 39, for example? That's what makes it frigid. And therefore, that's why a political settlement could be a venue for the possibility of amendment. That's what I mean. It's not my fear about the actors, but it is a process which is hostaged by the constitutional provision itself. Back to you, Saif.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Solomon. Thank you, Maskaram. Thank you, Dr. Getachew, and all our participants. As we reach the close of the hour, on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all our distinguished speakers, to all the 282 participants who joined our call, and those who have been providing support, for the publication of this project. And thank you for your invaluable support and contribution. Again, thank you, our distinguished speakers. We've been a little bit over time, but I think, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Good afternoon and good night. Good.
Bye.